Imagine a universe where gravity only applies to the poor.
Right. That sounds entirely fair.
I mean, think about it. If you are wealthy, or like if you belong to the right family, or you wear a specific religious symbol, you can just step off a cliff and float.
You just get a free pass on physics.
Exactly. The physical laws of the universe simply suspend themselves for you. And, well, it sounds completely absurd, right?
Completely absurd.
Because we know that if a billionaire and a beggar both step off a roof, they hit the ground at the exact same speed. Physics really does not care about your status.
It's totally blind to it. Yeah.
But for centuries, when it comes to moral and societal physics, human beings have somehow tried to convince themselves that the universe actually works like that.
Oh, absolutely. That there are loopholes.
Right.
We constantly try to negotiate with gravity. We try to find this cosmic bypass.
Yes, and that human obsession with finding a loophole is exactly what brings us to our sources today. Because, well, you, the listener, you have arrived at a massive milestone today.
A huge one.
This is the grand finale. We are looking at the monumental 13th and final part of this deep dive into Surah Maryam.
It's been a long journey to get here.
It really has. And we're drawing from the final lecture in a really sweeping analytical series based on the Tawheed Islam framework. And I just have to be honest here, the way this ending is usually taught, it goes out with a very specific, traditional kind of emotional fireworks.
Oh, yeah. The standard interpretation is, it's quite dramatic, very theatrical.
It is. So the traditional framing essentially says, we've reached the climax of Surah Maryam. And the chapter closes with God getting incredibly angry at people who claim he has a biological son.
Right. The wrath of God.
Exactly. He threatens to shatter the mountains, reminds us that everyone is just a number to him, and warns us that old empires were wiped out and just turned to dust.
Dust and ashes.
It's taught as this terrifying, highly emotional scene of an ancient deity basically bringing the hammer down on disbelievers.
Right. And it sounds exactly like an ancient epic poem. Like about an angry deity hurling lightning bolts from a mountaintop.
Totally. Zeus vibes.
Exactly. But if you look through the lens of the Tawheed Islam strategy engine, that interpretation entirely misses the point.
How so?
Well, this text is not a masterclass in divine emotional volatility. It is a masterclass in cosmic physics and civilizational forensics.
Wait, let me stop you right there. Shattering mountains as a lesson in cosmic physics.
Yes.
Because that is a massive departure from centuries of traditional theology. I mean, walk me through the actual math of that.
Right.
How do we get from God is angry to civilizational forensics?
So because the text isn't actually talking about personal emotional anger.
Okay.
The sources argue that the text is stating a systemic equation.
Yeah.
Basically, if you introduce an unproven biological loophole, like, say, benign sonship or special favoritism, into a universe that is built entirely on mathematical laws, you introduce a systemic glitch.
A glitch in the matrix.
Exactly. And that glitch is so catastrophic that if the universe actually operated that way, the physical fabric of reality would rupture.
Oh.
It's an ideological code warning against structural pollution.
I'm struggling with this leap a little bit. We are looking at Ayat 88 through the end of the chapter, and the text explicitly criticizes the claim that the creator has taken a walad.
Right, walad.
And walad literally translates to son or child. So how does the author of our sources justify translating a standard biological word into this really complex sociological theory about a systemic glitch or structural pollution?
Well, it's a great question.
Isn't that just kind of reading modern sociology into an ancient text?
No, not at all. And to answer it, we can't just rely on the standard English translations.
Right.
We have to look at the original Arabic roots. Because, well, the traditional translations have totally flattened the meaning of these words over centuries of, empire building and ritualistic thinking.
Or lost their edge.
Exactly. A wallet is biologically an offspring, yes. But functionally, within a system of law, what does a wallet actually represent?
Well, I mean, historically, the son of the king inherits the kingdom. He gets special privileges. He doesn't have to wait in line.
Precisely. A wallet placeholder represents any systemic shortcut or nepotistic bypass.
Ah, a nepotistic bypass.
Right. It's the ultimate anti-rationalist claim. It says, hey, we don't have to follow the unyielding law of requital, the law of cause and effect, because we have special elite connections.
We know the boss.
Exactly. Think about how the sources link this directly to the theological concept of atonement or intercession. The text refers to this intense human desire for a bypass.
So atonement meaning Someone else pays the price for your actions, a savior figure.
Yes, and the sources outline this as the prime historical example of a systemic glitch in human societies.
Because it disrupts accountability.
It stems from a deeply ingrained human desire to wash away the consequences of our actions without actually changing our behavior.
Right, we want the reward without the work.
We want to rely on a wall ad to pay the price.
Yeah.
But mathematically, what happens to a justice system when you introduce that kind of loophole?
Oh, I see where you're going. It's like diplomatic immunity in a deeply corrupt city.
Yes, perfect analogy.
If the elites know they can't get a parking ticket, or worse, go to jail for embezzlement or violence simply because of who their father is, they completely stop obeying the law.
Why would they obey it?
Right. They have absolutely no incentive to behave.
And then what happens to that city?
Well, the public loses all faith in the institutions, resentment builds up.
Yep.
The infrastructure rots because the public funds are stolen by the elites, and eventually the city just collapses from within or burns down from riots.
Exactly. So the wall ad concept doesn't just ruin a theological debate in a vacuum. It corrupts the foundational code of human accountability.
Because it breeds exploitation.
Yes, because the elites can act with total impunity, hiding behind the shield of this unearned grace or intercession. And this brings us to a really crucial term in verse 90. The word is hada.
Hada. What does that mean in this context?
The text says the claim of a walad is a hada. It's a monstrous, destabilizing assertion.
Monstrous.
It says the heavens are about to shatter, the earth split open, and the mountains collapse in devastation because of this claim.
Which brings us back to my earlier pushback, actually.
Right.
Because the traditional reading says the mountains are collapsing because God is furious, just incredibly angry. But you're saying it's an equation.
It is a mathematical certainty of social physics. The universe operates on the law of requital, cause and effect.
Action and reaction.
Right. If you drop an apple, gravity pulls it down. If a society builds its infrastructure on justice and equitable resource distribution, it thrives.
Makes sense.
But if a society commits systemic injustice, it fractures. Now, if you assert that actions do not have equal consequences, like that a wallet can magically absorb the consequences of millions of people's exploitation, you are fundamentally denying the physics of reality.
So the text is saying, if the universe actually operated the way this walad concept suggests, where cause doesn't lead to effect, and consequences just disappear into thin air because of a divine loophole, the physical laws holding the heavens and earth together would literally fall apart.
Physics would break.
Just shatter.
If A leads to B in every physical science, but you claim A leads to nothing because you have a VIP pass, the entire formula of the universe dissolves.
That's incredible.
So the shattering mountains aren't a threat of punishment,
Yeah.
They are a vivid illustration of what a universe without the law of requital would look like.
Complete structural collapse.
Exactly. Total system failure.
That makes the text infinitely more terrifying, to be honest, but in a logical way, not a superstitious one.
Right. It grounds it in reality.
Then let me pivot here for a second. If Walid and Hada describe the forces that collapse a society, there has to be an opposing force, right?
There is.
Because if the VIP pass destroys the city, what is the systemic glue that holds a functional city together?
The text provides that exact opposing force just a few verses down in verse 96. The word is wuda.
Wuda. Let me guess, the traditional translation softens this one too.
It absolutely does. The verse essentially says that for those who believe and do righteous deeds, the most merciful will appoint for them wudo.
Okay, and traditionally?
Traditionalists often translate this as affection or love. They interpret it to mean that God will magically make people like you.
Oh, okay, so it turns into a divine popularity contest. Like, if I pray enough, my neighbors will suddenly want to bake me cookies.
Which is an incredibly passive, mystical reading of a very functional text.
Right.
Systemically, the sources explain that wuda is organic social cohesion.
Organic social cohesion, okay.
It is the spontaneous trust and network alignment that fuses a society together when its institutions are genuinely built on justice and righteous action.
Righteous action being the key there.
Right. And the source material defines righteous action not as, chanting rituals, but as constructive, data-aligned societal building.
Okay, walk me through the mechanics of that. How does righteous action create this wuda? Because trust doesn't just magically appear out of nowhere.
No, it doesn't. So think about a society where the law of requital is actually enforced. A society where, without a shadow of a doubt, that if a politician steals from the public treasury, they will face the exact same judicial consequences as a civilian who robs a convenience store.
So no immunity.
Exactly. There is no wallad, there's no nepotistic bypass.
Man, in that society, I wouldn't have to constantly look over my shoulder.
Exactly.
I don't have to bribe a judge to get a fair hearing. I can actually invest my time and money into my community because I know the rules of the game are stable and they're fair.
And that resulting psychological safety, that unbreakable public trust that is Buddha.
Wow.
It is the invisible gravity that holds a healthy civilization together.
Yeah.
It's not magic at all, it's sociology.
Right.
When a society knows the rules of play equally, absolute trust emerges organically. And this directly contrasts the hadda, that monstrous lie of the loophole, which shatters trust.
This really highlights a strangely contradictory thing in human nature, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, if a system of fair, inescapable consequences creates trust and stability, which is what we all supposedly want, why do we constantly invent these wallad figures?
That's a great point.
Why do human beings so desperately want to believe in a biological offspring of the divine who can break the rules for us? Why do we want the bypass so badly?
The sources actually point us toward a massive logical distinction to explain this specific psychological flaw. It's the difference between biological reproduction and universal creation.
Okay.
The text deeply contrasts tawalid, which is reproduction, with khalq, which is creation.
Okay, let's break those two down. Tawalid versus khalq.
Right. We, as human beings, we operate on tawalid. We reproduce biologically.
Because we're biological creatures.
Exactly. And that process inherently requires pre-existing materials. It requires a male and a female, a mixing of genetic codes, a physical gestation period, and inevitably an eventual decay.
It's a closed system.
Yes. Because this is the only way we know how to generate life, we constantly try to anthropomorphize universal laws. We project our own biological limitations onto the ultimate creator.
So we create God in our own image, basically.
In a way, yes.
Because we have sons to carry on our legacy or, to pay off our debts, we assume the originator of the cosmos must need one too.
Yes, but the sources detail a rigorous logical breakdown of this biological fallacy.
Yeah.
They reference the broader Quranic principle of badis or samawati wal ard.
And what does that translate to?
It means the originator of the heavens and the earth. To create something out of absolute nothingness. The source material explicitly mentions nothingness.
Oh, wow.
Khalq, true creation, does not use pre-existing materials. It is the initiation of something entirely unprecedented.
So if someone claims God has a son, a biological walad, they aren't actually elevating God. They're severely downgrading the concept of the creator.
Exactly.
Because logic dictates that to have a biological son, God must have a physical partner, and he must have used pre-existing materials,
Right.
which instantly reduces the originator of the universe to a mere biological organism, subject to the very laws of physics and time that he supposedly created in the first place.
It's a massive philosophical demotion.
Yeah.
If God is biological, then God is subject to decay.
Right.
The source text points out the ultimate logical collapse here. Think about it. If the creator can bring the entire staggering complexity of the cosmos, the billions of galaxies, the laws of quantum mechanics, the forces of gravity into existence from sheer nothingness without a partner,
Yeah.
why on earth would he suddenly need a physical biological partner to produce a single sun just to fix a problem on one tiny planet?
When you lay it out like that, it sounds completely ridiculous.
It is logically absurd. It's an assertion that fundamentally misapprehends what the universe is and how it was generated. And the author of our sources actually brings up a darkly comedic anecdote to illustrate this.
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
To show how absurd this biological projection really is
Mhm.
when applied to the concept of atonement.
Yes, the boardroom meeting. I really want to dive into this because it perfectly captures how we project our own broken legal systems onto the universe.
It's a brilliant analogy in the source.
The source frames the theology of a savior shedding his blood to save humanity as this ridiculous corporate negotiation.
It's a powerful illustrated tool.
Mm.
It strips away all the emotional reverence and exposes the mechanical absurdity underneath.
Okay, let's play this out for the listener.
Let's do it.
Imagine the Father creates humanity and sets up the strict rules of the universe. The law of requital, action equals consequence.
Right.
Now, humanity predictably breaks the rules. So the Father, who is apparently bound by his own system, is obligated to punish them. But he doesn't really want to.
He's stuck.
So the Father and the Son hold a closed-door boardroom meeting to figure out a loophole to bypass the Father's own rules.
The divine negotiation.
Exactly. And in this meeting, they decide the son will volunteer to shed his blood. He will take the punishment, essentially paying the fine, so the father can technically fulfill the requirements of the law while letting everyone else off the hook.
Right.
It's portrayed as this absurd collusion between two executives hacking their own justice system.
And what's fascinating is that when you remove the dramatic choir music and, the stained glass windows, you're left with a mechanical contradiction.
A glaring one.
If the creator is the one who instituted the law of requital, why would he need to engineer a theatrical, blood-based loophole to circumvent his own law?
Exactly.
If he wants to forgive an action, why not just build a system of restorative justice? Why go through this convoluted biological theater?
It really makes the creator look impotent, like a mid-level manager trapped by corporate HR policy.
Exactly. The source argues that this narrative wasn't created by a rational universe. It was created by ancient humans who operated on tribal systems of blood money and ransom.
Blood money.
Right. In ancient tribal law, if you killed someone, your tribe could pay the victim's tribe a ransom blood money to avoid a cycle of vengeance.
So you buy your way out of the consequence.
Yes. The elites could afford to pay the blood money, and the poor could not. So humans just took their primitive, class-based legal systems and projected them onto the cosmos.
So the idea of a savior paying for your sins isn't a divine revelation at all. It's just cosmic blood money.
That's what the source suggests, yes.
It's the ultimate Wallad bypass. It proves that the universe does not run on biological loopholes. It doesn't run on backroom deals.
No, it doesn't.
So if the universe rejects all of these human projections, what does it actually run on?
It runs on cold, hard, exact tracking. Which brings us to the engine of reason, and what the sources call the absolute tyranny of unproven assertions.
The tyranny of unproven assertions. That's a strong phrase.
It is. The text points us directly to verses 94 and 95, which focus intensely on mathematical tracking.
Okay, walk me through those verses. What is the actual mechanism being described?
The text explicitly states, Ahsahum wa adahum ada, which means he has enumerated them and counted them a full counting.
Counted them a full count.
The universe has counted them and numbered them exactly.
To numbered them exactly. That is uncompromising.
It completely destroys the tyranny of chaotic assertions. The universe does not run on whims, it does not run on tribal favoritism, and it certainly doesn't run on magical loopholes.
Right.
It runs on numbers, data, and precise accounting. Every single action, every structural decision a society makes is logged in the physical and sociological reality of the world.
So it's not about being a quote-unquote good person in some vague, sentimental way where your good intentions magically outweigh your destructive actions.
Not at all.
It's about data points. But how does this actually play out for the individual or the institution? Because, I mean, we constantly hide behind groups, don't we?
We do. We love to group up.
We say things like, I'm part of this nation or I belong to this religion, so I'm covered.
And that is exactly what began again. Verse 95 dismantles. The text uses the word yatihi, meaning everyone comes to the ultimate reckoning.
Everyone.
Whether that reckoning is a historical crisis where society collapses or the ultimate day of judgment, every entity enters it utterly alone, stripped down.
Naked to the data.
Exactly. You cannot say, oh, we are the chosen people, or our ancestors built great mosques or cathedrals.
The universe does not care.
The universe doesn't care about your label. It cares about your functional data.
Let's ground this in a modern reality for the listener. It's like an IRS audit, but at a cosmic level.
Oh, a perfect analogy. How does that audit function?
Well, when the auditor sits across the desk from you, you can't bring your accountant to take the fall.
Nope.
You can't bring a wallet. You can't point to a plaque on the wall showing your family's long history of philanthropy to excuse the millions you're currently hiding in offshore accounts.
They won't even look at it.
Right. You can't say, but I belong to the political party that supports the IRS. The auditor does not care about your feelings, your family tree, or your political identity. They just look at the spreadsheet.
The raw numbers.
It's just you, alone, and the raw data of your financial actions. The math either balances or you go to jail.
That is exactly what adahum wadahum ada means. The math always balances.
It always balances.
And what happens when entire modern political empires try to ignore this law? What happens when they try to form alliances based on vague labels and unproven assertions instead of actual functional merit?
They set themselves up for a massive collision with reality.
Precisely.
And this leads us to one of the most fascinating parts of the source material, a real-world application of this exact theory, civilizational forensics.
It's a brilliant case study.
The author gives us a perfect historical case study to examine what happens when nations try to use the Walid bypass on a geopolitical scale.
Yes. The source text recounts an event from the Cold War era.
Right. And before we dive into this specific anecdote, I just want to be crystal clear with you, the listener.
Good idea.
We are impartially relaying this event exactly as it is presented by the author in the source material. We are looking at the ideological strategy they are describing to understand the mechanics of quote-unquote shared belief.
We are not endorsing any specific geopolitical stance, past or present.
Exactly. We are just analyzing the physics of alliances as laid out in the text.
Understood. So the author describes a specific moment during the Cold War when Western, primarily American powers, were trying to build a massive global coalition against the Soviet Union.
Okay.
The strategic framing was essentially the free world versus the atheist bloc.
A classic binary.
Right. And the call went out to various nations, particularly in the Middle East and the broader Islamic world, saying, hey, we both believe in God. The Soviets are atheists who want to destroy religion entirely. Therefore, as believers, we must unite into a single front.
Now, on the surface, I have to admit, that sounds like a very logical, pragmatic political move. You know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
It sounds incredibly logical.
If Group A and Group B both have a religious foundation, they should team up against Group C, which actively wants to burn down all the temples and mosques. It just makes intuitive sense.
It makes surface-level sense. But the author of our source material fiercely rejected this alliance.
Fiercely.
And the reasoning he provided is a brilliant, real-time analysis of structural pollution.
Okay, break that down. Why did he reject it?
Because saying we both believe in God is functionally meaningless, it is actually a dangerous illusion if the definitions of that God are entirely incompatible at an operational level.
Walk me through the mechanics of that incompatibility, because if two people say, I believe in God, most people just assume they are talking about the same general concept.
Well, let's apply the terms we just learned from the text.
Yeah.
The author points out that the Western Empire in this scenario, historically and structurally, operated on a concept of God heavily influenced by the Walid principle.
The bypass.
Right. Their underlying societal software allowed for nepotism, atonement, and the idea that you could exploit other nations through colonialism or economic extraction without facing divine consequence as long as you belonged to the saved group.
Because they had the VIP pass.
Exactly. You had the VIP pass.
Okay, I follow. And the opposing system.
The author argued that the true Quranic system operates strictly on the law of requital. Actions have exact, inescapable consequences.
Right. Ahum wa'ada hum ada.
Exactly. There is no wallet, there is no VIP pass for exploitation. So if you align a system based on strict mathematical accountability with a system that inherently believes it has a divine right to bypass accountability, you aren't worshiping the same operating system.
You're using the same word God, but you mean two completely different laws of physics?
Exactly. Therefore, they cannot form a genuine wuda, that organic cohesion we discussed earlier.
Because the foundation isn't shared.
You cannot build trust between a nation that believes in mutual equitable survival and an empire that believes it is divinely authorized to extract your resources. Their core codes are just completely misaligned.
So the author is essentially saying that an alliance based purely on the label believer is a trap.
The source explicitly uses the term cannon fodder.
Oof. Cannon fodder.
The author argues that this call for unity wasn't about a genuine spiritual alliance at all. It was an exploitative alignment.
An exploitative alignment.
Yes, it was geopolitical strategy to use developing nations as cannon fodder in a proxy war, masking deep systemic and ideological differences behind vague, emotionally charged labels.
It's basically a way of saying, hey, we are brothers in faith, so go fight our enemy in the trenches while we secure the oil fields.
Precisely. And if you join a coalition where the core operating principles of your partner are completely incompatible with mathematical justice, you are participating in your own systemic destruction.
You're letting the virus in.
You are introducing structural pollution into your own civilization. You are allowing the wallet glitch into your network.
I think this raises an incredibly important question for us today, even totally outside the context of the Cold War.
Definitely.
How often do institutions or corporations or political movements still use this exploitative alignment.
Every single day.
They use a massive buzzword like freedom or democracy or innovation or human rights to create a united front. But functionally, the partners in that front have completely incompatible definitions of what those words actually mean in practice.
It happens constantly in modern geopolitics. And corporate mergers, too.
It's a way to mask deep systemic differences just to extract value or resources from the weaker partner. You sign a treaty for mutual defense, but mathematically, one side is providing the resources and the blood, while the other side is providing the weapons contracts.
And it always fails in the long run because it defies the law of requital.
The math doesn't work.
You cannot build a stable structure on a foundation of contradictory physics. The organic cohesion, the wuda, will never materialize. The alliance will inevitably fracture under the pressure of reality, and it usually leaves the weaker partner devastated.
So if vague labels and exploitative alignments are so incredibly dangerous, how does a civilization protect itself?
It's a matter of data security.
Right, because to prevent these kinds of manipulative misinterpretations, a society needs a precise, uncorrupted code. It needs a mechanism to secure its own data so that a word like walad or requital can't just be redefined by an invading empire to mean whatever they want it to mean.
And that is exactly what the source material tackles next, focusing on the linguistic blueprint of the text itself.
Yeah.
We move to verse 97.
Okay, verse 97, the verse that talks about the language of the revelation.
Yes. The verse states that the Quran was made easy in the prophet's tongue, meaning Arabic, specifically to deliver glad tidings to the cautious and to warn the fiercely argumentative. Now, traditional commentary often stops at a sort of cultural pride regarding the Arabic language, that it's the most beautiful language, etc.
Yeah, that's the standard line.
But the author of our sources unpacks why there is such an immense functional emphasis on the language here. It is fundamentally not about ethnic superiority. It is entirely about data integrity.
Data integrity, meaning preserving the exact functional definitions of these concepts over centuries.
Precisely. Think about how language drifts over time. Words change, meaning based on culture, politics, and convenience.
Slang becomes official, old words lose their edge.
Exactly. The source discusses a critical, perilous moment in history during the time of the third caliph, Uthman.
What happened then?
The Islamic Empire was expanding rapidly across vast territories. Persia, the Levant, North Africa. People of various linguistic backgrounds were adopting the text, reading it in different regional dialects, and variations were beginning to emerge.
When you say variations, you mean people pronouncing things differently or actually changing the words?
Initially, just dialects. But in Arabic, a slight shift in a vowel sound, or the substitution of a culturally equivalent word, can drastically alter the root meaning of a concept.
It can change a precise sociological law into a vague mystical poem.
Exactly. Uthman recognized this existential threat to the data. He made the monumental decision to standardize the text to a single master dialect, the original dialect of the Revelation, and instructed that all divergent copies be removed and destroyed.
I really want to use a software development analogy here because it perfectly explains why this was necessary.
I would love to hear it.
It's exactly like maintaining a master branch in a code repository like GitHub.
Walk us through that.
Well, if you have a massive, complex operating system and you let 100 different developers around the world pull the code, write their own updates in different programming languages, or even just use slightly different syntax.
Yeah.
What happens when you try to merge all that code back together into one system?
You get conflicts.
Yeah.
Massive conflicts.
You get fatal errors. The system crashes. You can't run a financial network if one developer's code thinks a dollar has 100 cents and another's thinks it has 99.
Right, the math breaks.
The system requires an absolute source of truth. By standardizing the text, the original Arabic language acts as the uncorrupted source code.
That analogy captures the strategic intent perfectly. If Uthman had allowed the text to endlessly drift through translations and local dialects, the civilization would have eventually lost the exact precision of terms like the law of requital.
They would have just faded away.
A concept like walad would have slowly drifted back to just meaning a biological son, completely losing all its systemic implications of nepotism and structural bypass.
It would have become just another storybook.
Exactly. The standardization wasn't an act of tyranny, as some historical critics try to frame it.
Right.
It was an act of civilizational archiving. It locked the concepts into a specific linguistic matrix so that no matter how far history drifted, no matter how corrupt future empires became, the original data could always be recovered.
The blueprint was mathematically secured.
Yes.
It's a brilliant anti-corruption protocol built into the history of the text itself. It forces anyone who wants to actually understand the engine to return to the master branch.
You have to go back to the source.
You can't rely on a translated summary that a king or a conqueror might have smoothed over to protect their own power. You have to go back to the root code.
Which is exactly what this deep dive has been doing.
And this perfectly sets up the climax of our deep dive. Because the ultimate question is, what happens to societies that ignore this source code?
Right. We have arrived at the brutal, unyielding analysis of verse 98, the final verse of Surah Maryam.
The end of the chapter.
This is the absolute apex of social physics.
What happens to the empires that rely on those wallet loopholes, that corrupt their own data through exploitative alliances, and completely ignore the exact mathematical tracking of the universe?
It's severe.
I want to read this chilling final line just to let it sit in the air for a moment. How many a generation have we destroyed before them? Can you perceive a single one of them or hear from them the faintest whisper?
The faintest whisper.
And the specific word used in Arabic for whisper is riksa.
Riksa. This is the physics of historical liquidation.
Historical liquidation.
And what is profoundly fascinating here is how the Tawheed Islam strategy engine processes this verse. It completely refuses to read it as a vengeful god striking people down with a sudden bolt of lightning.
So no Zeus.
No Zeus. It reads it as the automated termination clause of natural law.
Automated termination.
Yes. Under the law of requital, if a civilization ignores the objective data, if it wastes its alignment system by falling for exploitative alliances, and if it relies on structural exploitation instead of actual merit, its lease on history is simply canceled.
Canceled, not just penalized with a fine.
Executed via a total system wipe. The universe isn't angry. It's infinitely efficient. When an operating system becomes entirely corrupted by glitches, viruses, and exploits, you don't keep patching it.
No, you'd just be wasting time.
You don't keep trying to run software that is actively destroying the hardware. You wipe the hard drive. That is historical liquidation.
But explain the mechanical causality of that to me, because when we say system wipe, it still sounds a bit mystical.
Fair enough.
Does a meteor hit them? Does the ground literally open up and swallow them whole? How does the math of exploitation actually result in a society just vanishing?
It is entirely mechanical and sociological. Let's trace the collapse, step by step.
Okay, let's trace it.
A society adopts the wallet principle, the elite bypass. Because the elite face no consequences, they begin hoarding resources.
Classic.
They extract wealth from the working class to fund their excess. Because the working class is exploited, poverty inevitably rises. Because poverty rises, desperation and crime increase.
And then the society responds with force.
Exactly. The society responds not with justice or resource distribution, but with militarized policing to protect the elite from the poor.
Which completely destroys any remaining luda, any remaining social trust.
Yes. The trust evaporates entirely. Without trust, supply chains begin to break down because no one wants to work for worthless wages. Citizens stop paying taxes or actively subvert the state.
It's a death spiral.
The military fractures because the soldiers realize they are just cannon fodder for the rich. When a society reaches this point of maximum structural rot, it doesn't take a meteor.
Right.
A minor drought, a slight economic shift, or a push from a neighboring empire causes the entire hollowed-out structure to collapse into dust. The system wipe is just the inevitable mathematical result of a society that has destroyed its internal cohesion.
It implodes under the weight of its own unproven assertions.
Exactly.
And that brings us back to the word riksa.
Riksa is an incredibly precise and devastating word. It means a complete erasure of their operational footprint. They don't leave a single functional whisper behind. They become a historical zero. The text is asking, can you even hear a faint sound from them? And the answer is no.
Just silence.
Because when the law of requital wipes a corrupt civilization, it clears the stage entirely. It bulldozes the rotten architecture to make room for a new vanguard, a new group that might actually respect the laws of social physics and align with the data.
You know, sitting here listening to this breakdown, I just want to pause and remind you, the listener, to think about the history books.
It's all in there.
Human history is completely full of empires that thought they were absolutely invincible. The Romans, the Babylonians, the Bronze Age kings, empires that possessed massive wealth, unshakable military power, and a deep, profound belief in their own exceptionalism.
They all had their own Wallad concept.
They did. Manifest destiny, the divine right of kings, unchallengeable elite status. They truly believed the laws of physics didn't apply to them because they were God's favorites. But under the unyielding law of requital, they vanished completely because their foundations were built on unproven assertions, not rational alignment. They became riksa,
A historical zero.
just silence in the desert.
It is the ultimate inescapable accountability. You cannot bribe history, you cannot charm gravity, and you cannot use a religious or political loophole to escape the consequences of systemic injustice. The math, eventually, always balances.
It's incredible, truly. When we look back across this entire 13-part series, the transformation of how we view this text is absolute.
It's a paradigm shift.
I remember Lecture 1, where we watched Zechariah evaluate the decay of his own religious institutions using rigorous, objective metrics. He wasn't praying for magic, he was diagnosing structural rot.
He was acting like an auditor.
And now, all the way to this final 13th lecture, where unproven dogmas and historical myths are completely mathematically liquidated, Surah Maryam has emerged not as a collection of passive stories, but as an unbroken, highly advanced manual for civilizational progress.
It is an unyielding blueprint. This concludes our 13-part strategy engine for Surah Maryam.
The final piece.
The old placeholders have been stripped away. The rational infrastructure of the universe is laid bare. And the blueprint for the digital archive is complete. It leaves no room for superstition, only for constructive action and absolute accountability.
And so, we leave you with one final provocative thought to ponder on your own.
Yes.
We've spent all this time talking about macro-level social physics, how the universe mathematically tracks every action, and how historical liquidation is an automated law for entire empires. But I want you to bring that lens down to the micro level, to your own life.
The personal audit.
Exactly. What outdated placeholders or unproven assumptions are you currently relying on in your own day-to-day existence?
We all have them.
Where are you secretly hoping for a wallet, a shortcut, a free pass, a nepotistic bypass to save you from the consequences of your own actions? Maybe it's in your career, your relationships, or your finances.
Just waiting for someone else to fix it.
Because if the physics of reality demand exact alignment and exact accountability, those loopholes aren't going to save you. They might just be setting you up for your own systemic wipe.
A structural reset.
Precisely. The math always balances. Until next time, keep analyzing the data.